Our first main goal of macroeconomics was rapid economic growth. Our second goal is reducing unemployment. What precisely is unemployment? That question may seem too obvious to need an answer. Unemployment, is when people don't have jobs, right? But when you think about it, the question becomes a little more complex. Should a spouse who is at home and not looking for work be counted as unemployed? What about a worker who has an unrealistic idea of how much pay he's going to receive, and he's waiting for a job offer which is never going to come? Defining unemployment is a way of clarifying these sorts of lines and definitional issues. Let's first talk about the official government unemployment rate, which is calculated by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. They do a survey, a monthly survey, and to be counted as unemployed in the survey, you have to respond to the survey by saying you don't have work, but you are looking for work. And both of those, that you don't have work and that you're looking for work, have to be answered yes for you to be counted as unemployed. If you say, I don't have work, but I'm not looking, then you're not counted as unemployed. You're counted as out of the labor force. The official unemployment rate, which is announced about the first Friday of each month, is based on this government survey that's carried out by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so they have to think about whether you don't have work, whether you're not looking for work. The key thing about the survey is to remember that when you divide up the U.S. population, it's not a matter of saying, do you have work or not have work? It's actually a three-way division. About a third of all U.S. adults of working age don't have jobs at all, but they're considered out of the labor force. So that one-third is out of the labor force, and then the remaining two-thirds is divided up into those who are employed and unemployed. And unemployment is just counted relative to the group that is in the labor force. When you define unemployment in this way, it has the usual advantage. You are at least using a consistent definition over time, so you can measure rises and falls. But the underlying meaning of it can also be somewhat controversial. For example, what if we're thinking about a worker who's a discouraged worker? They were looking for work for a long time, they couldn't find any, and eventually they gave up looking. They really would like to have a job, but they looked and they just didn't seem to be one available. Well, if they answer the survey, I'm not looking, they're not counted as unemployed. What about if you've got someone who's working part-time, and so when you say, are you working, they say yes, but actually the person would like full-time work? They're not counted as unemployed. What if the government statisticians call you up and say, are you out of job? Are you looking for work? And you answer, oh yes, sure I am. Yes, golly gee, I'm out there pounding the pavement 8 hours a day looking for jobs. But the truth is that you're not actually looking at all. You just don't want to say that to the government statistician who's on the other end of the phone line. Well, in that case, you're counted as unemployed, even though in some sense you may be out of the labor force altogether. Basic bottom line here, we talked about it with GDP, it'll come up over and over again. Economic statistics are not like measuring temperature. They aren't like talking about freezing and boiling points. They are concepts that are a little bit looser and a little bit fuzzier than that. Economists, when we look at unemployment, we see it a little bit differently from the government statisticians. When economists look at unemployment, economists see it in terms of the labor market and how that market works. In fact, economists define unemployment in terms of a supply and demand framework for labor. To economists, unemployment occurs when someone is willing to work at the going wage that's appropriate to them, given their skill and experience level, but they can't find a job. Now, how can that happen? How can that happen that someone has a certain level of skill and experience and they're willing to work, but no one's ready to hire them? Well, from a supply and demand point of view, what must be going on here is that wages are for some reason stuck above the equilibrium rate for that market, as would happen in the example of a price floor we talked about way back in Lecture 4. Remember that if the wage is above the equilibrium level, then that's going to encourage people to want to work. So there'll be a large quantity of labor supplied at that wage. But because the wage is above the equilibrium level, that's going to discourage some hiring. So the quantity demanded of labor at that wage is going to be somewhat less. So if the wage is for some reason stuck, at least for a period of time, above the equilibrium wage, then there's going to be a situation where there's people who want to work at that wage, given their skill and experience levels, and they can see that other people, given the same skill and experience, are working at that wage, but there aren't going to be people ready to hire them. Now, this, of course, just moves the whole question of unemployment back one level. So if the problem is that wages are stuck above the equilibrium level, then why are they stuck above the equilibrium level? And economists have devoted considerable effort these last few decades to questions of why wages might not be flexible downwards, why wages might be sticky, why they might be slow to decrease, and also to the policy implications of this idea. Well, let me give you some examples of why wages might be stuck above the equilibrium level for a time, at least for a time. One would be, what if there are minimum wage laws? A minimum wage law, after all, is a price floor. It says the wage can't go down below that level. So for certain kinds of workers, maybe it would be worth hiring them at some wage below the minimum wage, but it's not worth it at the minimum wage. There's also an issue of explicit labor contracts, like unions. If you have a union wage, a union contract, and it's 3 years long, well, maybe something happens in that market, like demand for the product that's being produced could drop dramatically. But that doesn't matter. The union contract is what the union contract is. And it's going to be very hard for the union to go back and renegotiate a wage decrease in the middle of a contract or in the future. There's also an issue of what are called implicit contracts. And the idea here is that many workers who aren't members of unions nonetheless have a sort of implicit contract with their employer. The implicit contract works like this. The business of the firm is, in any given month or week or even year, going up and down to some extent. They might make more money or less money. But you don't want your wage to be leaping up and down, a high wage when they're making money and then no wage at all when the firm is losing money. So the implicit contract is that the firm will pay you a relatively steady wage over time, perhaps rising some with your experience or if you acquire more skills. And in exchange for getting this steady wage over time, you won't get all excited if the firm makes higher profits one year because it could be temporary and then make lower profits another year. So the implicit contract is that the firm will pay sort of smooth wages over time rather than wages that directly affect the business conditions of the firm. Now, that implicit contract is sort of enforced by the fact that if you felt like the firm was really taking advantage of you, you would either quit or your morale would go way down. But it's an implicit contract, not an explicit one, and it would make a firm reluctant to cut wages because workers would view that as a violation of the implicit contract that they thought they had with their employer. More broadly, there's this question of a fear of what cutting wages would do to morale of workers, perhaps especially the morale of the better workers in a firm. In any firm, there's going to be sort of a spread of workers from, higher quality to middle quality to lower quality. Can't have everybody being above average here. And so in that situation where some workers are going to be quite good, if you reduce wages for everyone, those best workers are going to be the ones who find it easiest to go get jobs somewhere else. And any firm that cuts its wages has to worry about decreasing everyone's morale, but in particular, maybe losing its best workers altogether. So, for all those kinds of reasons, economists have argued that wages are not likely to be sharply flexible downwards. Now, a final reason could be that people might wait to take a job that's a good fit. And so if wages aren't flexible downwards, and we're sort of thinking about why wages don't go down, it could be that wages don't go down because when workers are looking for a job, they're just sort of sitting and waiting for a period of time. And they look and look and look, and there's sort of a natural process of searching. And employers are just going to sort of wait for people to sort themselves out. They aren't going to push wages up and down to try and get someone and fire someone. They're going to set the wage, and then they're going to assume that people are sort of gradually sorting themselves out over time. So, we've walked through a lot of possible reasons why wages might not fall. And now we need to think a little bit about what the implications of this would be. all firms are at least somewhat reluctant to cut wages. And as a result, wages could get stuck above the equilibrium level. And if they're stuck above the equilibrium level, then you're in a situation where the quantity supplied of labor can exceed the quantity demanded of labor, and unemployment will result. Now, given that there's some unemployment out there, we now come to one of these questions that only an economist could ask. Why is unemployment bad? Or if you prefer, how costly is unemployment? Well, you can think about the costs of unemployment along two dimensions. One is unemployment harms the individuals who are unemployed. They lack income. Beyond the lack of income, there are issues of social pathology. There are social problems like difficulties between parents and kids or between spouses. There are issues like crime, and they seem to be linked to whether or not someone is unemployed. If you've had a family member be unemployed, as I have, or a relative, you know that it could just be enormously stressful in that person's life. And so the costs go beyond a loss of income, and they include the costs, the deeper costs that affect someone's life when they feel like they just don't know what they're doing, they don't know how they're going to pay their bills, they don't know what's going to happen next. From a big social point of view, unemployment also has costs. Unemployment reduces the size of the economy. After all, when a lot of people are unemployed, the economy loses the potential output of those unemployed workers. In very round numbers, let's say the U.S. economy is $12 trillion, roughly accurate number for 2005. If you had 1% more employment, in very rough numbers, and you could produce 1% more output, that's worth $120 billion. Now, it may be that on average, people who are unemployed have slightly lower skills, so that projection isn't exactly right. But it's also true that those people who are unemployed raise the need for government spending on welfare and social services. So it's not just a cost in terms of lost output of what they could have produced. It's not just that opportunity cost of lost output. It's also a cost to taxpayers and to government in terms of higher social benefits and social and welfare benefits. And so that combination of costs is real and important to society, both on the individual level and on the social level. Let's think about the types of unemployment. Economists commonly divide unemployment into two broad categories. They're called the natural rate of unemployment and cyclical unemployment. Let me talk about each of those in turn. The natural rate of unemployment describes the unemployment that occurs in an economy as a result of the dynamic ebb and flow of workers and industries. And that occurs in the context of the laws and the regulations that affect the incentives of employers to hire, or they might affect the incentives of the unemployed to take jobs. The idea of this natural rate of unemployment that exists within the economy was popularized among economists in a famous lecture given by Nobel laureate economist Milton Friedman back in 1967. In effect, in this lecture, Friedman pointed out unemployment isn't ever 0%. In an economy, some workers are always moving between jobs, or they're entering the labor force out of college, or they're retiring, or there's some family reason why they're going to be in or out of the labor force for a few years. The period of time that workers remain unemployed is also going to be affected by all the laws and regulations that affect the incentives of employers and of workers. Let me give you a couple examples. Say, an example of incentives that affect employers might be rules that prevent businesses from forming or make it hard to form a business, or prevent a business from expanding or building a new factory or a new facility in certain areas. There are also various kinds of taxes on employment. Really, we often call them benefits, but anything where you say to the firm, if you hire someone, you need to spend money on X, Y, and Z, to the firm, that looks kind of like you're taxing employment. There are also rules that make layoffs difficult. If you've got a layoff which you say firms are not allowed to lay people off without 90 days notice or 120 days notice, or there's some other rule about large severance benefits, firms are going to be reluctant to hire in the first place, because after all, they know that if they need to fire someone, they're going to incur high costs. Some examples of things that might affect incentives for unemployed workers would be, what if unemployment benefits or welfare benefits were relatively generous and had no particularly soon cutoff date? In that case, people might be tempted, at least some people, to remain on those benefits for a while and not to go ahead and change to something else, not by going out and looking for a job as in the best way that they could and really trying to get a job as soon as possible. So you take those kinds of factors, those incentives, the dynamic economy, people moving in and out, incentives for employers to hire, incentives for employees to work, and you're going to get some natural rate of unemployment that comes out of those different factors. Now, this natural rate of unemployment isn't a natural law like the freezing point of water. It's an expected outcome given the existing social institutions. It's important to think of natural unemployment as not something that's a constant, that can't change, that's fixed. But instead, you sort of want to think of the natural rate of unemployment as saying there's a certain unemployment rate that you should expect year in and year out, given the rules and regulations and incentives that govern workers and employers in the labor force. And you're going to get that natural rate of unemployment even when the economy is going well. If you want to change that natural rate of unemployment through public policy, you need to change some of the rules that set the incentives for hiring and firing. And the key question here then becomes, how can society provide the protections it wants to provide while still keeping incentives to work strong and keeping incentives to hire strong? So let's think about some of those possible programs. And I should say, I don't want to endorse all of these programs necessarily, but I think they're the kinds of things that you would want to talk about if you were thinking about how you should reduce the natural rate of unemployment. So, one example would be, when we think about the unemployment benefits that people receive, one thing that happens now is that unemployment benefits are commonly received for 6 months. And one of the facts one observes is that there are an awful lot of people who, if they don't find a job right away after the first month or two, they spend the whole 6 months on unemployment and then they find a job just about when their benefits are running out. So, instead of having a situation where the unemployment benefits are flat and then they cut off at some point, how about a situation where unemployment benefits are higher at the start when you really need some help, but then they start tapering down over time to provide a continuing incentive to go out and find work? Another policy recommendation: be very careful before you pass a government policy that prevents or discourages firms from firing workers. Because if you prevent firms from firing, they'll be discouraged from hiring also. Be careful before you advocate a government policy that raises the costs of hiring a worker, like by requiring that firms also pay for all kinds of additional benefits. Firms don't want to pay more than they need to, and that will tend to discourage them from hiring. Be careful before you pass rules that limit the hours businesses can be open or the days businesses can be open. Because when you pass rules like that, firms are not going to be hiring workers at those times. And of course, you can also think about expanding government programs that provide job search assistance or retraining that might help people find that next job more quickly. So that's the natural rate of unemployment. The other main kind of unemployment is called cyclical unemployment. And cyclical unemployment, the cyclical part, refers to the business cycle. It refers to the economy moving in and out of recessions. In a recession, firms are not able to sell as much as they had expected. And so firms will reduce their workforce or cut back on hiring. Sometimes economists say labor is a derived demand. And what they mean by that is firms think about how much they're going to produce, and then they think about how many people they need to hire. So labor is a derived demand from how much firms want to produce. Now, in a recession, lots and lots of businesses all at once don't see a lot of demand for their goods and services. And so, in terms of derived demand, they don't see why they should be hiring people. Recent example. In 2000, the year before the U.S. recession of 2001, the unemployment rate was 4.0%. In 2002, the year after the recession, the unemployment rate was 5.8%. a lot of that jump is probably a movement in cyclical unemployment. What's the policy solution for cyclical unemployment? Well, the policy solution would be for the government to fight the recession, to fight the lack of demand for goods and services. How can government encourage people to buy more stuff? Well, we'll talk more about these sorts of policies and tools later on in these lectures, but the quick overview is that they can use fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, remember, involves taxes and government spending. If you give people tax cuts, then they're likely to spend more, or the government could spend more directly. Either of those would have more demand in the economy, and more demand for goods and services should be a bigger derived demand for labor. In terms of monetary policy in the Federal Reserve, you can have lower interest rates. Lower interest rates will encourage borrowing for things like cars and houses, and that will encourage firms producing those kinds of things to hire more people. Now again, we'll come back to these sorts of tools of fiscal and monetary policy in more detail in later lectures. We'll devote several lectures to each. Let's talk about how unemployment rates have actually evolved in the United States and in Europe in recent decades, because the evolution has reflected both different natural rates of unemployment as well as the patterns of cyclical unemployment. If you look at a graph of U.S. unemployment rates over time, you'll see those unemployment rates were relatively low from the 1950s up to the early 1970s. And by relatively low, I mean they were typically between 4 and 6%. Really, really good years were a little bit under 4% unemployment. Really, really bad years were a little bit over 6% unemployment. But then, as you look at the 1970s and into the 1980s, you see unemployment rates getting systematically higher across the board. The good years are coming in at about 6% unemployment, or maybe a little bit less, and the bad years are often something like 8% unemployment. Indeed, in 1982, for the year as a whole, there's nearly 10% unemployment for the entire year. In the 1990s, then unemployment rates come back down, more in the range of the 1950s and 1960s. That is, again, good years are kind of in the range of maybe 4 or 5%, and bad years, like right after the 2001 recession, get up close to 6%. So, broad storyline here if you're trying to summarize all this. You can certainly see cyclical unemployment. Unemployment is rising and falling when recessions hit, like 2001, like the 1990-91 recession, like back in the early 1980s. But despite these sort of fluctuations in cyclical unemployment, you can see that there's an underlying natural rate of unemployment which doesn't seem to change a whole lot over time. And very roughly I'll emphasize, you might think that natural rate of unemployment for the U.S. economy is roughly in the range of 5 or 6%. However, there's some reason to believe that maybe the natural rate of unemployment was a little bit lower in the 50s and 60s, a little bit higher in the 70s and 80s, and then maybe has come down a little bit since then. Why might that be? Why would the natural rate have moved over those decades? Well, one possibility is, the 1970s were a time of dramatic economic dislocation. There's the productivity drop-off we talked about in the previous lecture. There's high inflation, there's deep recessions, and that means there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy. And so the incentives of firms to hire in that time were somewhat reduced. They had to worry about whether they were going to survive. Another thing that was going on was that high inflation was eating away at the wages people were earning. And so people might have been uncertain about whether to work, whether it was really worth it, given the high inflation that was eating away what they earned. Also, the baby boom generation, the generation born right after World War II, is beginning to age at about that time. And as the boomers go through the 1960s, a lot of them are sort of entering the workforce and getting ready. By the 1970s and 80s, those folks it's not clear if they're working as much or if they're beginning to sort of move toward retirement, at least some of them. And so that would also change the patterns of how many people are likely to work. European unemployment rates rose dramatically in the 1970s and early 1980s, like unemployment rates in the United States. But the difference is that across Europe, the unemployment rates, in a way, never came back down. In many countries of Europe, unemployment rates have hovered at 10% or higher for most of the last few decades. Well, why is that? Why have they hovered at that higher rate? most economists think the natural rate of unemployment is higher in Europe. And there's a bunch of reasons, if you look at European labor markets, why you might expect that to be true. Minimum wages are often much higher in a lot of European countries. Unions, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, are much, much stronger. The prohibitions against firing workers are much stronger as well. There are often limits on when businesses can open, whether they can be open on weekends or evenings. And there are often requirements from the government that there be lots and lots of benefits for employees. All of those things are going to tend to make the incentives to hire and to work somewhat less. And so all of those things are going to tend to generate a higher natural rate of unemployment. Some evidence in favor of this hypothesis is that European countries which have made an effort to reform these kinds of policies, like the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, have seen a dramatic fall in their unemployment rates, more toward United States levels. And they have managed to still keep their protections for workers and the unemployed at higher levels than those that generally exist in the U.S. economy. Overall, society might face some tension as it tries to increase the number of jobs. And this is a little bit disconcerting because more jobs and favoring job growth are practically a political mantra, even when the unemployment rate looks in some ways fairly good. In 2004, for example, the unemployment rate for the year was 5.4%. Now, that wasn't great compared with the boom years of the late 1990s, but those boom years may well not have been sustainable in the long run. 5.4% unemployment actually stacks up very well with unemployment rates going back through the 70s and 80s and even back a little bit earlier. But during the political campaign of 2004, sometimes when politicians talked about unemployment, it sounded as if we were practically back in the Great Depression all over again. The difficult question is, creating jobs is possible, but you want to have both good jobs and also jobs that pay decent wages. And this is where we begin to really run into some hard trade-offs. Since the 1980s, the United States has had relatively low unemployment rates compared to Europe. But the United States has also had relatively low growth in average wages. For example, if you look just at the category of production non-supervisory workers, so not management, production non-supervisory workers, the weekly pay for that kind of worker after adjusting for inflation was essentially the same in 2004 as it was in 1980 after adjusting for inflation. And it was actually a little bit lower for that kind of worker than it was in the 1970s. There may be a trade-off here, that the greater supply of labor and the low unemployment in the U.S. labor force is leading to a lower price in the labor market and helping to hold down wages. Now, European countries, on the other hand, discourage work in a variety of ways. All the rules we talked about, the longer vacations, the shorter work weeks, and all those sorts of things. But if you do have a job in Europe, you are well paid. So there may be some trade-off here between low unemployment and lower wages and high unemployment but high wages for those with jobs. Ultimately, over time, the labor market will tend to push wages close to productivity. After all, if a worker is receiving more than he or she produces, then the business will fire them or maybe just not give them much of a raise for a few years until matters level out. If a worker is worth more than their wage, then a competitive alternative employer should be willing to come along and offer them a job above their current wage because they're such a good producer. So over time, the question of average wages and how they increase over time really relates back to the question of the previous lecture about productivity and economic growth. Now, from my own point of view, I think it can be frustrating or exasperating to watch top business executives rake in enormous multi-million-dollar bonuses, and I don't intend what I'm saying here as a big defense of those bonuses. But I do mean to say that in the long run, achieving higher wages on average for 130 million workers in the U.S. economy is not going to happen by redistributing a few $1,000,000 from top executives. The only way for a sustained basis for strong wage growth over time is to have workers that are more productive on average. And that means investing in better education for those workers, better equipment, and being flexible about developments of new technology. The best policies for job creation are to reduce the barriers to hiring and firing. That helps bring down the natural rate of unemployment. And in recession, to help stimulate demand in the economy. The best long-term policy for high wages is to improve productivity. And if you can have an environment where all of those come together, then the mantra of good jobs at good wages becomes achievable.